Welcome to the Phase Space Invaders podcast, where we explore the future of computational biology and biophysics by interviewing researchers working on exciting transformative ideas. Our today's guest is Paul Robustelli, an assistant professor of chemistry at Dartmouth College who works on modeling intrinsically disordered proteins. Paul became renowned in the community for his contributions to the force field modifications that significantly improved the simulations of unstructured proteins. And that was while he was doing his postdoc at the Show Research, a private institution that made headlines around the biophysics world with their bold goals and an unconventional funding scheme. However, as he explains, his fascination with disordered proteins was born out of his experience with partially unstructured systems studied by NMR and a desire to push the boundary of what can be modeled with atomistic simulations. So we talk a lot about the interface between academia and industry, how the once tight boundaries are becoming fuzzy and porous, and how we can use it for everyone's advantage. But then we move on to discuss the cultural dimension of academia and how the stereotype of a boring and strict professor hides the complexity of us scientists as human beings, with our often quirky hobbies and passions. Paul makes the point that we can all benefit from a change of perspective, where we see ourselves, tongue-in-cheek of course, as overpaid artists rather than underpaid office workers. So in an effort to emphasize some positive aspect of why we're all here, let's all appreciate the similarities between academia and other creative ventures, and let's put more effort into making it our advantage. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Paul Robustelli, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks a lot for the invitation.
The scientific path started with inferring structure from NMR data, but then you joined the side of chaos and decided to move into disordered or unstructured proteins at the Show Research. And the big breakthroughs that came out of that were the Des-Amber force field and the associated water model that I think revolutionized that field at the time. In a way, it was a peak hype moment where people saw the power of big money thrown at molecular simulations, perhaps for the first time. Though now we have many more examples. At the time, it's kind of insanely boosted our confidence that what we are modeling has some reality to it. And for the first time, we approached the promised land of simulations, which was you put things together and they figure out what to do, where to bind. Now that you're back in pure academia, how do you feel about the different dynamics of these two worlds?
Yeah. So let me go back to the start, I guess, because disordered proteins and motion has sort of been a slowly evolving part of my career. But I actually, so as an undergraduate, when I was 19 years old, my first chemistry research project, I'd done some biology research, was looking at these flexible organic molecules and measuring NMR data, scalar couplings and RDCs and relaxation parameters, and then coming up with an ensemble of conformations to reconcile that data. So it was something that was like one of my very first exposures to molecular structure and research. And then that sort of colored where I would go to grad school. So then I was excited about that. And I saw that the Van der Scholo lab and the larger Dobson group was at Cambridge were taking these approaches for proteins. And so that is sort of what brought me there. And that is really where I kind of, the huge center of understanding of misfolding and aggregation. And that's where I was exposed to IDPs and got interested in IDPs. And I always sort of viewed disordered proteins as we started doing structure and dynamics as, the extreme test of that. Getting the rotamers and ubiquitin, which was like I feel like when I was a PhD student, right, like every computational integrative paper was another model of ubiquitin, and it was like two rotamers and a hydrogen bond. So that's where these ideas were sort of developed. And then, I sort of viewed, all right, once we get out of this sandbox, like what's the hardest thing we can do? And I was lucky to sort of work on a cool protein that was half folded, half disordered when I was doing a postdoc in Art Palmer's lab. And then, by the time I decided to go to DSHR research, it seemed like the real blind spot of force fields. We all kind of knew they weren't working well. They sort of had been starting on this TIP4PD water model that was in the works when I joined. And so that was kind of the most fertile region, I think, for additional like rapid development. I would say that for me, the appeal of sort of simulation has always been this interface where it's absolutely essential. Like you can't, it's not just like a shortcut for experiments, but it's something that needs to be hand in hand with experiments. And so for that, disordered proteins was like the clear, it was always going to be a key piece of this.
Right. So pushing the frontier. It's a very common theme here. So far,
Yeah.
everyone, I think, has said that hand in hand in experiment is the new way to go, which is just the last 10 years, right? But
Yeah. But in terms of what you mentioned for these new finance models or ways of funding science, I think D-Shaw research it is really interesting for someone to just devote a large chunk of their personal fortune to funding things. And I think, yeah, protein folding they were sort of lucky to have hired some great protein folding scientists in Creston, Lindorf, Larson, and Stefano Piana early on. And so that became a very natural application of these supercomputers. And I think that was kind of a big moment for the field in terms of being able to systematically look at folding that we have data on of many proteins with the same model. And I think maybe there was always this feeling that, all right, well, this lab can fold this protein with this force field, and this lab can fold this protein with this force field. And in a sense that it was like, how much of this is cherry picked? How robust is this really? And I think those early science papers from D-Shaw research, I think did play an important role in sort of the taking people outside of the field to take it seriously. I think there's always been a good segment of structural biologists, or particularly biologists, who like think we're just playing video games all day. I have a friend who's an anesthesiologist who refers to my research as video games. So I think D-Shaw, it's how the video game's going. So I think, yeah, that folding, those earlier results were an important sort of milestone for recognition from the broader fields, from broader structural biology and biologists.
Yeah, I repeat, that is, I think, equally important for us to believe in what we're doing and for other people to believe in what we're doing, right? Because they can be two disconnected questions.
Yeah. And then in terms of the model, so that was a really interesting model, right? That you have one person devoting their own personal finances to this. And then he sort of set it up in a way that he was at the top of this organizational infrastructure and kind of everything went through him. And we got to shape the vision to an extent, certainly, but it's sort of, right, not necessarily the Bell Labs, here's your money, go do what you want, write whatever papers you want sort of scenario. But yeah, it did expose me to sort of, as someone at that career phase where I was like finishing a postdoc at Columbia and sort of thinking about, all right, so if I apply for professorships now and I get a startup of this size, like what is going to be tractable? And then to sort of look at, all right, well, if I have these resources here, what can I accomplish in that same amount of time? And not necessarily wedded to that institution for my whole life or that sort of model. But it was, yeah, an early time where it was, I could look outside the traditional structure of your startup and your first NIH grant and sort of make a calculus about what is it I could accomplish. And sort of one of the things I was really excited about disordered proteins and the notion of drug discovery for disordered proteins. And that was kind of kicking around the Cambridge labs and Vanderscolo and Dobson and looking for aggregation inhibitors. And, at that point, that was done largely in the dark, right? We didn't have any structural models of these binding events. So my goal at D-Shaw Research was always, all right, can we improve the physical models? Can we use this to demonstrate that we can model ligand binding for disordered proteins? And then having demonstrated that or determining whether or not it works, what can I then do with the next step of my career? Like to take that demonstration, and then it becomes easier to write NIH grants to study these things. And so kind of like using this one resource and model of funding to enable another path. So as you mentioned, that was kind of early on, really new, but we've seen a number of sort of, even within that sector of people who made their fortunes in hedge funds, making large donations to institutes. You have the Loeffler at Stony Brook, a huge investment there. You have the Flatiron Institute, which were all slightly different models where you could be giving money to a department and letting them do what they see fit with it, or you can sort of create an institute outside of a university hierarchy where maybe you have a little more say in what the sub-regions of funding are, but, a different model from DCR research where you have one person who's an author on all the papers. And it has been really interesting. And then I think along that timeline, in my period since leaving DCR research to start a lab at Dartmouth, there was, and maybe some of this was just a zero interest rate phenomenon, but there was this huge rush of funding for computational startups. I mean, there's a huge rush of funding for all startups, but you were seeing a lot of people you knew doing postdocs or starting labs, maybe starting a company on the side or switching to start a company. And you start to think about this practical question of, well, if I have my startup and my NSF grant to work on this problem I'm passionate about, or, there is a VC who is willing to kick in some certain amount of money, which may be substantially larger than your startup and your NSF grant. Is that something you could do for a little while? And then you also have these things like Altos Labs, where you're sort of buying labs wholesale to come out of the university into a private funding environment. My friend Andrew White, who maybe you've reached out to for this, but right, he has this company that he's been a part of founding, Future House, which is looking at AI agents, and that has some backing from Eric Schmidt, private philanthropy in a more hands-off way. And I think it's kind of a very exciting mixture right now. And I'm kind of optimistic about watching these things evolve and having many different models. Because on the one hand, when I was coming up through the system, there was all this sort of the giant increase in the number of PhD students in the early 2000s and the steady amount of faculty positions, and no one was retiring. And there was kind of this glut of scientists. And for a long time, it was, everyone was kind of like, oh, the goal is to be a professor. And that was like mathematically, statistically impossible now. And so I think that this, in some ways, right, and funding agencies have been like, what's the solution? But in some ways, I think maybe we're looking at it sort of evolving, where you have many different hybrid models of funding in science.
It bursts the pipe of supply in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are now on the crossroads, right? Finishing the PhDs and thinking where to go. And as you alluded to with the different models, there's probably going to be different degrees of liberty in terms of what to study or how to approach your problem, and different rewards. So there's a sort of trade-off. Do you think there is a sort of trade-off in how free I am to approach an interesting project versus how free I am to, achieve something, develop my skill as a future PI? If someone thinks of becoming a PI one day, is it a consideration, when choosing whether to go to industry or to stay in academia?
So one of the things I'm hopeful for is that these boundaries are going to continue to become more porous. And I think that is kind of best for everyone in terms of not having this stark dichotomy. And right, so I'm someone who has gone to sort of a weird industry funded thing. But I've kind of always had my eye on the prize of being, publishing papers and the time I worked at DCR Research, I was going to the same conferences. I was interacting with the same academic network, very much considering myself a member of that network and trying to doing things that would value that network as much as it would, the overall pursuit of integrative structural biology and the community of academics studying disordered proteins as much as it would benefit the company I was working for. And I would say that I thought that transition was great, that that experience I got really informed. My network grew that whole time. I got to try a lot of different things with different amount of resources. It really informed sort of the grants I started writing right away. I think I had sort of a more mature understanding of mentoring, being in an environment where you have, they're hiring a lot of early career scientists. And so I think it was a great help. But it's interesting now as my first PhD students are looking at jobs and they're sort of applying to a smattering of, they're thinking, all right, if I did an academic postdoc, what would I maybe do? But also applying to various biotech companies at different stages, some larger Series D funded biotechs, and then sort of also poking around and looking at some of these Series A, Series B companies. And it, I guess, compared to when I was finishing my PhD, I think it was, there's just so many more options, I think. And what is nice is that, not everyone can get an entry level computational chemistry position at Sanofi or Merck or whatever. But I think a lot of these biotechs, maybe earlier phase, are going to be a much better route into sort of developing an industry than academic postdocs.
Yeah, I think it's an incredible thing one incredible thing we can learn from the industry is the structure, is the management and the accountability that they have. You can also ask whether, the merging or the blurring of lines between academia and industry has any perils like conflicts of interest or different incentive structures. I think it's a valid question we could ask if it's fine to blur the line in the sense of most people being somewhere in between, or is there any value in preserving the distinction between academia and industry? I don't know. I'm kind of agnostic there, but it just comes to my mind as a natural question.
Yeah, it's an important question, I think. Yeah, it's a good question. I would say if we think sort of the old model, and I kind of want to bring up the Open Force Field Consortium and the Molecular Software Foundation as models of sort of a hybrid. But so in the old days, right, Merck would have hired their computational chemists and they would have worked behind closed doors with Merck resources to build something like the Merck Molecular Force Field. And that was eventually released. But kind of the lessons along the way were sort of kept firewalled and and a lot of that was proprietary. And so I think if all the IP remains safely in its legally protected buckets, just the transfer of expertise back and forth is going to be valuable for everyone. For people who have learned the lessons of what we're done with the resources at companies to then have that inform the problems you're posing academically. And then for me, so even since I started my lab at Dartmouth, I've been involved with a couple companies in terms of sponsored research and some consulting. And for me, it's super important to understand like the boots on the ground challenges. Like, what are the scientists working on today? Like, what tool could you develop that a company trying to drug IDPs would use next year or right now? And so I like to be close to that. And that informs the questions I ask. And then I also have much more obscure kind of academic questions that are just fun. Like, can we use topological descriptors of disordered proteins and make models and things like that are just, emerged from coffee breaks at conferences, talking to topologists and are fun to do.
Yeah, I love this because you're kind of making the point that you can keep both, right? So keep doing meaningful science that has real life applications and pushing some boundary in theoretical physics or theory of simulation without necessarily committing to either.
Yeah. And we've seen, you never know what basic science discovery is going to rapidly become hugely important in industry applications, right? Like,
yeah, totally.
Many of the ingredients of AlphaFold are probably seen as like pretty obscure machine learning research at some point. So I think we're all sort of aware. And I think the companies are increasingly aware, right? Like, so things like Open Force Field, right? These are companies who want more transferable models and they're buying into these efforts and understanding that it benefits everyone. And I can only hope that consciousness continues to grow and we see more of this, but I think you can do both, right? I don't think one thing that I do feel like is if anything, there's a little too much pearl clutching of IP, which like I get if you're a lawyer, but as scientists, I think you have an understanding, like if you work in these organizations, it's like, all right, well, we could have our legal team spend however much time safeguarding some possible thing that arises out of this, but we sort of all know that this isn't going to be that important. Or like, this isn't going to, this little nugget of whatever is not going to be the difference between a drug or not a drug. Like maybe this boundary is best understood by scientists and not lawyers in terms of what's important. I get it, right? Why they have to do this. Like you can't raise money with venture capital and then give the structure of your compound away to an academic to like make a patent free. But I think there's a lot of gray things that are seen as gray area now that are not actually gray area, that in the hands of scientists, you'd be like, this doesn't matter. Sort of like force field is an example of that. It's like, this is a model that if everyone uses, we all win. And I think the more scientists make those decisions, the sort of more will go back and forth.
Yeah, perhaps scientists and lawyers don't really mix well together. To switch to the other question, well, scientists and scientists should mix together well. And I loved it when I reached out to talk to you on the podcast when you asked, well, can we talk about metal music? And yeah, the point being that we as scientists should find non-scientific points of interest or non-scientific topics on which we can find common ground, right? Scientists being humans, we're not just one-dimensional people thinking, doing one thing only in our lives. Actually, many people are polymaths. So yeah, you had some reflections on how we can enhance the non-scientific or non-purely scientific collaboration between scientists.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, well, I just remember as an early career scientist having this, as a 19, 20-year-old kid, feeling like I had to have this like kind of stoic professionalism with my mentors. And it probably did serve a purpose in a way. I don't know, it maybe kept me a little more like business focused. But I guess I would say that, well, as I moved further in my career, like as a PhD student and then as a postdoc and was fortunate to have some, very like kind advisors and colleagues who were interested in like the personal interactions, or I guess I would put it another way. I realized that like not just the intellectual content, but one of the awesome benefits of science that maybe some of my friends in more conventional industries, like work in New York City and you work in advertising or you work in finance, like you often get sort of an archetype, and a lot of people in those professions are going to be maybe like socioeconomically a little more homogeneous. And one of the huge benefits of science is that like it's a crazy mix internationally and background wise, and we all come to an interest in models of proteins in very different, unique, idiosyncratic ways from different nations, from different educational systems. And it sort of became clear to me, right, when I was working in Midtown and seeing sort of the homogeneity in Midtown Manhattan when I was at the ACR Research and the people around me, that, when I would go to these conferences and hang out with these, like, if you can get some of your older colleagues to like start telling stories about when they were in graduate school in the 70s in Berkeley or whatever, or, when they were living on commune in Vermont, you realize, I guess I had a better appreciation for how diverse of a group of people that participate in science and how important that was to me. And that's sort of one of the main interests. And then I guess, so for that, knowing that this is what is exciting and appealing for me and just made me sort of feel, having that be a big advantage is as I continued to sort of move on in my career, to the point of now being a PI at a university, it became clear, right, that I don't have to keep a stoic professionalism with my students. I can tell them about my interest in sports and in music and hip hop and metal and mountain biking and skiing. And I think in terms of inclusivity, you do your students a favor to show that like we are not just like stoic equation crunchers, that like we all, and you sort of want to sell science on that diversity. And one thing that has been fun is as it's just sort of come up conversationally, as I found, I like a lot of different types of music. I like metal, I like punk, I like hip hop, I like jam bands. When you just start bringing these things up, you realize that a lot of your colleagues also, who maybe you'd only talked about metadynamics with, also like bands and stuff. And it deepens kind of the connection. And I think it sort of helps.
Yeah, I think Twitter was one of the catalysts as well, right? When people started sharing their personal stuff on Twitter. And now I actually have two accounts. I have a personal account for all the political stuff, and I have a professional account for sciencey thing. But I think many people inevitably mix some personal life with some professional life there. And then you get this idea that, oh, these people, have many dimensions, have many things going on in their lives. And I have to give shout out to my institute, to the IRB, for giving us a space to do all different things. We have a football league here. We have a rock band in the institute. My point is, people would want to spin it as, something that increases productivity and so on. But I think it has a great value just in keeping us sane from most of the initiatives that we have, the social things here. We don't create new scientific projects while playing football or while practicing a song. But it's just a great way to talk to other scientists in a way that is not 100% scientific. Well, it's obvious to talk about work-life balance, but yeah, I think it could be underappreciated.
Yeah, I think this can really be a strength of a career in science, having more outlets to sort of appreciate the varied texture of personalities involved.
We often read biographies of past scientists, right? Either Einstein or Fermi or whoever. And they are, in those biographies, they are very often quirky, and all the interactions they have with people around them are non-trivial very often. But then I think this complexity gets lost in the public perception of a scientist as someone very rigid and proper and businessy.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And one thing I always try to think about, and maybe like a little bit informed from sort of working in a skyscraper in Midtown for 5 years, is that I think it makes more sense almost to view the scientific community like more of as an artistic community in a way. And in some ways, like people who devote their lives to studying the motions of molecules have lifestyle wise, like maybe more in common with people who play jazz or people who paint, in that there is maybe standard paths of financial success or trajectories in society that, you are interested in, maybe more self-motivated by your own vision or kind of looking for something different. And I sort of, when people are talking about doing postdocs, like whether or not you should do a postdoc, I always say this, that we all benefit as scientists to think of ourselves as the most well-paid and having the best health insurance of all creative pursuits, right? Like if a painter could at age 22 get a stipend in health insurance to paint all day, like that would be a real privilege. Where sometimes I think scientists can think of themselves as like the least well-paid or the least compensated white collar, right? And so I think when I talk about when people ask me about doing a postdoc, I almost think of it as a musician. Like this is your chance to go make an album with like the artist you respect most in the world. And maybe that's not like the shortest path to your most economically gainful scenario. But if this is something you're passionate about, and this represents an opportunity to collaborate with people who could be at the top of their craft, and if that experience is meaningful for you, like almost in the way that like, oh yeah, maybe I won't make that much money on this tour, but I can play backup for this person, or I can write a song with my musical idol or whatever. Like, I think sometimes that's the right way to think of it. And then in that way, like that makes one of the benefits, right? One of the things that jazz musicians like about being jazz musicians is that you hang out with other jazz musicians and not like gray-faced Midtown money men riding the commuter train. And so that is something that should be celebrated, that this is a creative pursuit with creative personalities. And we can talk about metal music, and we can talk about avant-garde art and whatever it is that
right.
We can celebrate that diversity. And
I love this point because I myself love to hang around artists, and I think there's a lot of stuff we can learn from their mindset and like aim for incorporating parts of this creative mindset into what it means to be a scientist. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a cool experience. My last year in graduate school at Cambridge, I had this shared house on Jesus Green in Cambridge. Really lucky. Like the conservatives of the CAM let this house alone on the park fall into disrepair. It's called the Lockkeeper's Cottage. It was a historically listed building. And we were interviewing people for roommates to fill the last room. And one of them was an art student at the Cambridge Art Institute. And and then that sort of circle of, it was all PhD students, but we kind of made friends with all these artists, and having sort of my eye on that subculture. And, I would go visit London, and they were all living in these warehouses in Hackney Wick and enjoying the fruits of being in an artistic community with like-minded people. And that was something that I think we can all enjoy as scientists too. And it was informative that there was this overlap, I think. And I think the art students, it was fun for them to make friends with PhD students and have sort of these conversations across these different worlds. But I think, there is a similar creative spirit in both pursuits, and that should be celebrated.
Right. Happy to put it out there for people to start striving for a more artistic set of values in their lives.
And maybe we could all dress a little cooler,
Yeah, definitely. Let's do that. Okay. So, Paul Robustelli, thank you for talking to me and to our listeners. It was a pleasure. Hope you have a great day.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This was great.
Thank you for listening. See you in the next episode of Phase Space Invaders.